I am Mark, son of Mog. I've come here to challenge the lies that have been spoken about my father. Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Sins of the Father, which is episode 17 of season 3 of Star Trek Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll is the Next Generation episode, Sins of the Father. So, Sins of the Father is the episode that begins with the Klingon First Officer coming aboard the Enterprise with the exchange program to serve as a temporary First Officer. However, it's soon discovered that Kurn is actually Worf's brother, who came on board to inform him that their father is being accused of conspiring with the Romulans on the attack in which he himself was killed. Worf and Picard traveled to the Klingon homeworld to make the challenge, but it was doomed to failure as the Klingons actually discovered the traitor was the father of a man named Duras, and that his family is too powerful to take the blame, so Worf agrees to discommendation, where he becomes an outcast amongst Klingons in order to preserve the Empire. So, this is obviously a very classic Next Generation episode and one of the most memorable ones, and in many ways it's groundbreaking and it paved the way for many great episodes to come after it. First of all, this is the first time we really delved deep into Klingon culture. While it's true, the Klingon warrior way of life was established in the original series episode Day of the Dove and the film Star Trek III The Search for Spock, and its culture of a warrior class as well as its tentative friendship with the Federation and Next Generation times was explored in Heart of Glory and A Matter of Honor. But this episode, I believe, is the first that establishes what will become known as Klingon culture in the Star Trek franchise from here on out. I would say it solidifies it even more, makes it clear exactly what Klingon behavior and mythos is as we visit a Klingon world and see how official proceedings take place. But more than that, more than just exploring Klingons, this episode does a lot to flesh out Worf's character, as well as we get a lot of his backstory that I believe was the first time we hear his father's name, Mog. And we learn that he has a brother, and we get to see how he reconciles his Klingon heritage with him serving in Starfleet. As here we get to see him embrace Klingon, his Klingon heritage, as not only does he meet his long lost brother, but he puts his life on the line in order to clear his father's name. But more than that, this episode was groundbreaking in terms of having a long-term story arcs in the Star Trek franchise, as at the end of the episode, Worf effectively gets outcast from Klingon society and gives up all rights on his Klingon heritage, and we will see how this will affect him whenever the Enterprise interacts with Klingons, as they regard him with disdain. Although at the end of the episode, Picard suggests to Kurn that this dishonor could last generations, but in actuality, Worf claims his family name and his place in Klingon society in the premiere episode of Season 5, so less than 2 years later, so hardly generations. However, in the case of storytelling in the show, I feel this storyline would have worn thin had they dragged it out any longer, so I actually agree with their decision to have his name cleared within 2 seasons. Many, including the writers themselves, will refer to this as the first in a trilogy. Some even call it the Klingon trilogy, that specifically deals with Worf's discommendation and his feud with the Duras family, and the internal conflict within the Klingon Empire. The other 2 episodes in this trilogy are Reunion and Redemption. Of course, technically that's 4 episodes because Redemption is a 2-parter, but calling it a trilogy refers to Redemption as 1 episode, which I personally consider most 2-parters has 1 episode as it tells 1 story. However, even outside of this trilogy, there are many references made to Worf's dishonor and discommendation, such as in the episode The Drumhead, where a misguided Starfleet admiral tries to use his discommendation against him to discredit him, or in The Mind's Eye, where Worf deals with a crooked Klingon ambassador who doesn't care about his discommendation, but we soon learn that's because he's working with the Romulans, and he warms up to Worf because he falsely assumes that Worf is friendly with the Romulans as well. So, this episode was co-written by Ronald D. Moore, who would go on to become a well-known writer on The Next Generation, a producer/writer on Deep Space Nine, and a showrunner for Battlestar Galactica. This, I believe, was the episode he made a name for himself and that he personally felt most proud of. In fact, between this episode and Reunion and Redemption, he once said in an interview that he became known as the Klingon writer, so he would later struggle to make a name for himself outside of Klingon episodes. I do believe his influence is most felt in introducing long-term story arcs, a practice that Moore seems to be a champion of, and one of the reasons why I personally love his writing style. Long-term story arcs like this would become commonplace on Deep Space Nine and Battlestar Galactica. In fact, a storyline very similar to this one occurred on Deep Space Nine, where Quark becomes an outcast by Ferengi culture, and is not allowed to interact or do business with any Ferengi. Although this story arc only lasted 1 year, and in my opinion was considerably less effective as this one, but more interesting to me is the fact that after Deep Space Nine finished his run, Moore attempted to join the writing staff on Star Trek Voyager during its 6th season, and apparently had several ideas for long-term story arcs involving Janeway, but these ideas were firmly rejected by head writer Brenna Brega, who is notorious for being against long-term story arcs and is more in favor of episodic storytelling. This disagreement resulted in Moore rage quitting after only working on 2 episodes, and this disagreement was said to have threatened his friendship with Brega. I, of course, take Moore's side and say that Voyager's final 2 seasons would have been greatly improved had they allowed Moore to have his long-term character arcs, but that's just me. Anyway, getting back to Sins of the Father, I always thought of this as a good, strong episode of The Next Generation, but not one of my favorites. I actually prefer the other 2 episodes in the Klingon trilogy, but I appreciate this episode as the one that sets it all up. But as a standalone episode, it feels kind of incomplete. This episode is groundbreaking for what it sets up, though. In addition, to the aspects I already mentioned, it introduces us to 2 recurring characters. Kurn, who will make several more appearances on The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and Duras, who, although only appears in 1 other episode, his family name will become infamous as it's carried on by the recurring characters of the Duras sisters, and in Star Trek Enterprise we even meet his ancestor, whose name is also Duras, who goes on a blood quest to kill Captain Archer for embarrassing him. So basically, the Duras name is used to personify the worst quality of Klingons and those who do not get along well with the Federation. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Duras name didn't pop up on Star Trek Discovery sometime soon. However, as an episode in its own right, it reminds me a lot of an episode of The Simpsons in terms of structure. Now, for those who may not know what I'm talking about, a typical episode of The Simpsons will often begin with one storyline, but will eventually somehow lead into another storyline that is totally different and in no way related to the first one. Now, this works for The Simpsons because it's a comedy show, and I personally feel it's less effective in a serious drama like The Next Generation. As the episode begins with Kurn coming on board the Enterprise, serving as a new first officer in an exchange program, the same one we saw Riker use when he served as a first officer on a Klingon ship in the 2nd season episode A Matter of Honor. Now, I don't know how practical this exchange program is, but I do find it really interesting as it highlights the differences between the way the Klingons and the Federation operates. Where these are 2 allies, they are in fact extremely different by nature, so seeing them come together in the way is very interesting. So after seeing a Starfleet officer serve aboard a Klingon ship, I think it's a very interesting concept to see the reverse. And the first half of the episode deals solely with this, as we get conflicts between Kern and Riker, and has Klingon. Kern sees Riker as by his nature, he feels that Riker is a threat to his position as first officer. And also how Kern has a much stricter way of commanding than the crew is used to, particularly Wesley and LaForge, who feel Kern's style of command hinders rather than helps their performance. And I personally identify with them in this regard, because I had to work under people with this stern, no-nonsense way of leading, where nothing you do seems to please them, and I personally cannot function under those conditions and feel it hurts rather than helps performance, but that's just me. Anyway, this is an interesting storyline that is explored deeply, that is until halfway through the episode, when as soon as we find out Kern is Worf's brother, that storyline is completely abandoned altogether and never spoken of again. It's just gone. And instead we switch focus to the new storyline of Worf challenging the accusations made against his father. So while I agree this second storyline with Worf is more interesting than the first, it just seems really disjointed to me, like an episode of The Simpsons, except I don't think it works here at all. It almost feels like two different episodes. So I wasn't too surprised then to learn that this was indeed two different story ideas, to which Michael Piller decided should become one story idea, so he just dumped it on Ronald D. Moore and said, here, make this into one episode. And apparently there was doubt on whether Moore's script would be made into an episode, but Moore fought for it because of the strength of Worf's character story and because of the way it establishes Klingon culture. It did eventually get greenlit. But the reason why I think this script was in doubt was because, honestly, Moore did a poor job of blending the two story ideas, and it's all too obvious that these are two different stories. As the first story involving a Klingon exchange officer is never resolved in any way, shape, or form, it's just simply abandoned. I personally feel if they wanted the focus of the episode to be with the storyline with Worf's challenge, they should have focused more on that and minimized the whole Klingon exchange officer storyline, not spend too much time with Wesley whining or Kern threatening Riker's life, and just did a more condensed version of that to get more to the point of Worf's challenge, but that's just my opinion. As for the challenge storyline itself, this was fascinating, not only because it establishes Klingon culture, but also strengthens the bond between Worf and Picard, beyond simply a commanding officer and a subordinate, as it shows they share a deeper respect and appreciation for one another than simply two people working together. It was great, for example, to see Picard serve as Worf's Chadish after Kern is attacked. Also, this puts Picard's life directly in danger, and it's great to see him have to fight off an attack because of this. Also, it's great seeing Picard as the diplomat, as he directly challenges Kim Peck on his attempts to conceal the truth. Of course, an absolutely awesome moment is when Picard is challenging Kim Peck. Worf scolds him and yells, "The Chadish will be silent!" That was awesome, where Worf was like, "I command you now, bitch." And I'm sure Worf was probably scrubbing power conduits for weeks after that one. Well, Picard's not vindictive, but really, if he was, he would be. Anyway, so let's get into the whole corruption of the Klingon Empire. As I said, this episode really establishes Klingon culture, and part of what it establishes is that its government structure is very corrupt. As the leader of the Klingon Empire knows who is responsible for the destruction of a Klingon outpost, and he purposely frames an innocent man because the guilty party comes from a powerful family, and so accuses someone who he believes has no successors. What's more interesting is he allows Duras, whose family is actually guilty, to parade around in public like he's all high and mighty and act like it's Worf's family that is in disgrace when they both know better. So this speaks to the aristocratic and unbalanced nature of Klingon society, where those that come from noble blood have more privilege and those who do not have noble blood are just stepped on, which I do find fascinating. And this is an aspect of Klingon culture that will be explored more later in the franchise, particularly on Deep Space Nine, where that show ends with Worf getting fed up with the way that Klingon culture is, so he takes steps to put an end to it by putting a well-respected man who comes from commoner blood, whose family is not respected, and he puts him into power, thus suggesting that after Deep Space Nine, Klingon culture will progressively change from this aristocratic way of life. And again, this long-term story arc with Worf all began here, so you do have to admire this episode for that. So my rating for Sins of the Father out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. This is a very important episode of the Star Trek franchise that sets in motion many storylines that pay off throughout all incarnations of Star Trek and establishes firmly what we think of as Klingon culture in the Star Trek universe. It also has a very strong personal story involving Worf with some exciting and suspenseful twists and turns. However, as a standalone episode itself, it is a bit disjointed and feels a bit incomplete, and thus does not stand on its own as well as other Klingon-based episodes like Reunion. But it does need does need to be admired for doing a great job at setting up a lot of storylines that will have a stronger payoff than this one did. So that's it for my review of Sins of the Father. So now it's time to pick the options for which episode I will be reviewing next. Okay, so let's choose the options for what will be the options in the poll. So let's start with the original series. And the option will be the Tholian Web, third season episode where Captain Kirk and the derelict USS Defiant apparently are lost. The Enterprise grapples with insanity causing plague and attacked by the Tholians. This is quite a noteworthy episode for its recent references in Star Trek Discovery, which also were from references from Star Trek Enterprise. So it's also great to explore. Tholians became a well-known alien. This is basically the only episode they appeared in other than their brief appearance in Enterprise. So they've been mentioned like tons of times throughout all incarnations of Star Trek. So anyway, that would be an interesting episode to review. Next Generation option, and that is going to be Code of Honor. Oh, God. Well, if you really want me to rip a episode to shreds, you can choose Code of Honor, which is infamous for being a tad bit racist. And it was like the third episode, I believe, and it was absolutely horrible. I neglected to mention this in my top 5 worst episodes, and a lot of people were like, what about Code of Honor? Well, if you want to hear me talk about it, you can select that as an option. So then we go to Deep Space Nine, where the option will be Through the Looking Glass. Speaking of the Mirror Universe, Sisko is kidnapped to impersonate his deceased Mirror Universe self to gain Jennifer Sisko's loyalty in the Rebel Alliance. Now, I already did a review for Crossover, so this is the sequel that follows it, Through the Looking Glass. This episode was fine. I was okay with it. I think the Mirror Universe episodes on Deep Space Nine get progressively worse. Like, it started out with the best. This one was pretty good. The next one was kind of it. And the one after that was pretty shitty. And the one after that was total crap. So, if you want to hear me talk a bit more about the Mirror Universe, which is on everyone's minds because of Discovery, then you can select that one. Okay, so next we get into the Voyager option, which is Collective. Several Borg children abduct Chakotay, Kim, Neelix, and Paris. Well, that's a very small synopsis. But yeah, basically this is the introduction of the Borg children who become a recurring storyline, one of the few that Voyager actually does in its later seasons. This episode I talked about it a bit in my Voyager videos. It's fine and it's okay. I don't see it as great. I actually think there are better long-term story arcs that Voyager should have done. Equinox! Sorry. And so I was a bit sour about that, but yeah, if you want to hear me talk about that, I can talk about that. Okay, so finally we'll do Enterprise, which we had to do this old-fashioned way. Season 2. Oh, that's dandy. Season 2. Season 2, episode 11. Okay, so then we see what that corresponds to on IMDb. Get my mouse to work. Okay, season 2. Blah, blah, blah. Bring it down to episode 11. Episode 11 is Precious Cargo. So if you see my 5 worst episodes of Enterprise, you know this was number, I think, 1? Was this number 1 or was this number 2? I think this might have been my number 1 worst episode of Enterprise. So I think this is and you know how much I don't like Enterprise's first 2 seasons. For me, this is the worst of the worst. I could not stand this episode. Please do not select it because I don't want to have to watch it again. But then again, it might be fun ripping it to shreds. But yeah. So, those are your options. Be sure to vote in the poll, which you can do so by clicking on this eye icon in this little corner. It should be appearing there. Clicking there to vote in the poll, and I will be back here in about a week's time to review the winner. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Also, I do many more Star Trek videos as well as many other videos on shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.